Stanford University.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the new learning, and what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you some examples of things I've learned. 1066, Battle of Hastings. 1215, Magna Carta. I learned those things really well. Those facts got me an A on that history test. I did not know who fought the Battle of Hastings, why it was important, or what was in the Magna Carta. And you may have a few facts like that tucked away in your brain in the Velcro that's there that you learned over the course of your schooling as well. But schooling needs to respond to the demands of the age that it's in. And in fact, we've had different iterations of what school has been. In the Middle Ages, the school was really there for a very small number of people who needed to learn the religious books that were of import for them. In the industrial age, we were training people to be in factories and in mills, on farms with basic skills, learning especially obedience and discipline, how to follow orders, and do the same thing over and over again. Today, we've got a very different challenge facing us. And really, the challenge that we have is that 2/3 of today's young people will enter the workforce in a way that they will take up careers that don't yet even exist. They'll have to use technologies that haven't been invented to solve giant problems, climate change, food and sustenance for the world that we have not managed to solve. So what do we mean by the kind of learning that will be helpful to them? Well, the fact that things are changing rapidly in that regard is demonstrated by the fact that the demand for skills is changing in the economy. There's been a steep increase in the demand for complex communication and expert thinking skills, and a sharp decline in the kind of skills that our school system was designed to produce throughout most of the 20th century. That it was sort of routine, cognitive, and manual skills doing the same things over and over again. In 1970, the top skills for the Fortune 500 were reading, writing, and arithmetic. And by the turn of the century, the top skills demanded by Fortune 500 companies were teamwork, problem solving, interpersonal skills, and oral communications. You can still find reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they've fallen far down the list because the nature of work is changing, the nature of knowledge is changing. As a Stanford professor, I don't usually like to quote people from UCal Berkeley. And I know somebody from Berkeley is in the room. Cal is always here. How many? Yeah, all right, represent. But there are two professors there who are doing really amazing work, and they're plotting the growth of knowledge in the world. And they discovered in one of their studies that between 1999 and 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the entire history of the world preceding. Think about it for a moment. Knowledge is growing at an exponential rate at this point. Technology knowledge is now doubling every 11 months. So it's really impossible for schools to say, here are the facts that you need to know, 1066, Battle of Hastings, whatever, divide it up into the 12 years of school, spin it out to the students, have them regurgitate it back on the tests, and actually be prepared for what they are going to have to face, because they're going to have to work with new knowledge that hasn't been invented yet. So this ought to mean a dramatic change in the way we think about curriculum, teaching, and assessment. And in fact, it already is a sign of the changes that are happening in the workforce. If you go up the street to Google, down in Mountain View, they will not use your transcripts and your test scores to determine whether to hire you. They used to collect all of that data. They did gigantic studies to find out how it predicted your effectiveness in that organization, and there was no correlation between those measures and what people had to do on the job. What they will actually try to discover in the interviews is your learning ability, your ability to actually find new information, to solve a problem, organize it, weigh and balance evidence, figure out what's important, what's not important, analyze and synthesize that information, work with other people to design something, to test it, to get new information about how it works, and to go through an iterative process of creating new products, new solutions, and new knowledge. So that's really what our schools need to begin to focus on, is the creation of learning ability. Now, all over the world, this kind of conversation is going on. This particular slide about the changes in the expectations for learning comes from Hong Kong. You can see at the bottom of the slide that it was being used by the deputy minister there, Chris Wardlaw, as he was talking about mathematics in Hong Kong, China, improving on being first in PISA. That gives you a sense of the international competitiveness around changing education systems. And you'll see many of the things that you've heard about today in this auditorium. The ability to communicate, work in teams, solve problems, analyze, conceptualize. Very important is the ability to reflect on and improve one's own learning. That is, being able to be an internally generated learner, as well as to be able to manage your own work and oneself. So these kinds of skills, along with the way in which we learn content, it doesn't mean we're not learning content, we have to learn the content in different ways, are a very important part of the reforms that are being urged upon schools. The US is not first in PISA. This is data from the most recent program in international student assessment. The US was rated 21st in reading, 32nd in mathematics, 23rd in science, and has been sliding over a number of years. You see little countries like Singapore, which had almost no education system in 1965 when it became independent, soaring to the top of the rankings for a number of reasons. One is that we administer education or fund it much more unequally than most of these countries. We spend 10 times as much in public schools on the education of some students as we spend on the education of others, and that's typically allocated in line with race and class and the other inequalities we have in society. And that doesn't even count what we spend in private schools, which is typically even much more. But in addition to that, we've been focusing a lot of our learning in ways that are very different than other countries. What's holding us back in part is that we've been teaching for the wrong kind of learning. Now, this is a sample from a California standards test. We just eliminated those tests and brought in new assessments in California. But until 2 years ago, you'd see an item like this. Take a very close look, because I'm going to ask you to respond. John's solution to an equation is shown below. You can see the equation. Which property of real numbers did John use for step 2? Was it A? Let me see a show of hands. Anybody think it's B? Anybody think it's C? And D? All right, well, a few of you I saw, particularly in this area, did know that it was the zero product property of multiplication, so you had memorized the name of the property adequately. However, most of the rest of you have had satisfying lives doing important work. And you wonder whether the amount of time it may take to learn that fact is really paying off in the problem-solving abilities that people may hold. So when we think about this kind of...
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The Tariff Bill, the Hawley Smoot Tariff Act, which anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.
So you can see the kind of education for memorization that, you know, has been part of the staple of many schools for a long time. And you heard earlier from Carl Wyman why that method of teaching has much less good effects than many others, which he termed scientific. And that's actually part of the process, is not only changing the way in which we think about what teachers do, but also how we think about the curriculum and what schools do. So what kind of schools do we need? Obviously, we need schools that can move from the industrial age with the kind of focus as we have had in recent years on filling out multiple choice standardized tests as the basis for rewards and sanctions that determine what happens to kids and teachers and schools, to schools where kids are investigating, inquiring, discovering, and using knowledge in new ways. In Singapore, which I mentioned earlier, had reached the top of the rankings. The education minister noted a few years ago that the goal is less dependence on rote learning, repetitive tests, and a one-size-fits-all type of instruction, more on engaged learning, discovery through experiences, differentiated teaching, the learning of lifelong skills, the building of character through innovative and effective teaching approaches and strategies. And Singapore is among many nations that have overhauled their curriculum and assessment system and the nature of their pedagogical system. In Singapore, rather than filling in a multiple choice standardized test, students in high school will complete a science assessment, for example, which they identify a problem, design and plan an investigation, make and record their observations, analyze data, write up all of this into something that looks like a small journal article. They are becoming the scientists and technologists of the futures, while our kids in many cases are consigned to memorizing information and bubbling in. So we need to build bridges to new learning. And I was just in New York City actually giving a talk on the 100th anniversary of another institution's founding, and ran into a project that that institution's students had undertaken, which I think exemplifies some aspects of the new learning. Having heard a speech by President Obama recently about the fact that the Tappan Zee Bridge is falling apart, and if anybody's here from New York, we have New Yorkers in the room? Of course, yes. The Tappan Zee Bridge, as you may know, is one of the longest bridges. It's very complex. The Hudson River has a rising and falling tides. It's a time of fiscal constraints. It's going to be difficult to replace the Tappan Zee Bridge. These students took up that task to design a replacement for the Tappan Zee Bridge. They studied and visited the 125th Street Bridge, the Queensboro Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, drew sketches, did measurements, looked at the way in which spans and suspensions and shapes were designed to counteract or confront different kinds of traffic and seafaring patterns. They took the Circle Line tour around Manhattan, which goes under 20 bridges, and then went back and studied each of those. They studied construction principles. They evaluated the options for materials. When they got back to the classroom, they developed sketches and designs. They tested replicas. They went through a process of writing a rationale for the materials and the costs of the bridge. And at the end of it, they designed a quite plausible solution to the problem of replacing the Tappan Zee Bridge. Now, these were not students from Columbia's School of Engineering. They were second graders in a New York City public school, Midtown West, that is associated with Bank Street College, which was having its 100th anniversary, where this kind of pedagogy is routine in every class for every student every year, all the way through the end of school. And there they are in their bridge study. So how do successful schools develop new learning? Some of my research has been looking at schools that get extraordinary results, many of them in urban contexts, working with low-income students, new immigrant students, and others. And among the things that prove to be very important is personalizing the education so that teachers know students well. That often means redesigning the way high schools are organized so that there are advisors who are able to work directly with students. Rigorous and relevant project-based instruction, lots of integration with real-world problems, authentic assessments where students are designing and conducting experiments and investigations, the notion of respect and responsibility and revision, because you actually learn by getting feedback. You've heard a lot about that today, and revising your work until it meets a standard. And teachers who have lots of opportunities for professional learning. In some schools that I work with all across the country, their evidence for graduating now is a portfolio in which students have to produce a high-level, rigorous scientific investigation, a literary analysis, social science research, mathematical applications, world language proficiencies. All of these, as Dan Schwartz said earlier, represent the mode of learning in a discipline. And every discipline has a different mode of learning. And when you learn that inquiry strategy well, you've mastered the way in which you can continue to learn within and hopefully across disciplines. Interestingly, students from these schools even when they come from inner city communities, are not only going on to college at higher rates, but they're completing college at rates almost twice as high as the average American student, which is about a 40% completion rate for college for the average student. They are completing at a rate of closer to 80%, and they'll tell you it's because this kind of learning was at the root of their schooling throughout all of the years where they were involved. More colleges are encouraging this kind of learning. MIT has just encouraged students to submit portfolios of evidence, collections of evidence like this, as part of admissions, as have 800 other colleges and universities around the country. And this is particularly important for us now because we're in an era where no society can succeed if the individuals in it are not learning in a way that they will be able to solve the problems that are facing them and engaging throughout the entire society, not just in a small elite, with the kind of development of knowledge and invention that is essential for 21st century societies and economies. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.